It's Friday the 16th of June and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh and Cardiff and here in Westminster with our parliamentary correspondent Sean Curran. On the programme this week. MPs are told that Boris Johnson did mislead them over lockdown parties at Number 10.
Boris Johnson lied. He lied to MPs. He lied to the people of this country.
My advice to all Right Honourable and Honourable members is, having had the committee carry out the work we asked them to do, is to read the report.
ITV's chief executive denies she ignored rumours about Philip Schofield's affair with a younger colleague.
Nobody here or on the management board would ever turn a blind eye to something as serious as this.
Angry scenes in the Senate as party leaders clash over policies during the COVID pandemic.
Was it the right decision to discharge patients from hospital to social care homes without testing that you took and your health minister took at that time?
I think the Leader of the Opposition lets himself down, and more importantly, he lets down the families who look to the inquiry to give them answers to those questions.
And as the government gets tough on disruptive protests, some in the House of Lords say their concerns were ignored.
Any future minister, at any time, could decide to change any law in any way. Now, this to me is deeply, deeply disturbing.
Well, I'm joined here in the studio by our parliamentary correspondent, Sean Curran. Now, Sean, MPs have spent most of this week waiting for that report from the Privileges Committee into whether Boris Johnson misled the House over those lockdown parties in Downing Street. And it finally came yesterday.
Yes, 9 o'clock on Thursday, we got a blockbuster report from the Privileges Committee, 30,000 words. And as expected, it concluded that Boris Johnson had misled the Commons over whether or not lockdown rules had been followed in Number 10. But also because of the huge political storm that had been created ever since Boris Johnson sort of preempted the report last week when he announced he was standing down from Parliament in protest at its findings. It delivered this verdict where it said that if he had still been a member of the House of Commons, they would have been recommending that he would have been suspended for 90 days, something that would have inevitably led to a by-election. So it sets the stage for what could be a very dramatic debate next week when MPs will be asked to approve the report. There was an early little bit of exchanges when the Leader of the Commons, Penny Mordaunt, held her regular Q&A with MPs, and that's when she sets out the business for next week, and it's also when her Labour shadow, Thangam Debonair, gets to talk about the business. And so we got a little bit of a hint of how things will go when the two had their exchanges yesterday morning.
Boris Johnson lied. He lied to MPs, he lied to the people of this country, he lied to nurses, doctors, care workers, bus drivers, everyone who was putting their own lives at risk during the pandemic. I thank the committee members for the thoughtful and considered work that they've carried out over a year under constant intimidation from the former Prime Minister and his friends. They did as we asked, diligently, and we should all be grateful. Will she confirm the government will give the House the opportunity to approve and endorse the report in full?
My advice to all Right Honourable and Honourable members is, having had the committee carry out the work we asked them to do, is to read the report, is to make their own judgments about it and take the task that is our privilege to do seriously and soberly, and members should use their own judgment on that. I can confirm that the motion before us will be votable, it will be amendable, and it is House business, and so I am expecting a free vote. These are difficult matters for the House. We have to look at the evidence, we have to look at the report, but we are talking about people who are friends and colleagues. It will be a painful process and a sad process for all of us, the task that we face on Monday.
And of course, a little bit earlier in the week, we saw the return of Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer to Prime Minister's questions after a week off. And of course, a lot had happened since they last met. Yes,
Rishi Sunak missed last week's Prime Minister's questions because he was in America meeting Joe Biden. And you might have thought that that would have been what they'd have ended up talking about this week. But almost as soon as the Prime Minister arrived back in the UK last Friday, his trip was overshadowed by, first of all, the publication of Boris Johnson's resignations honours, and then the news that Boris Johnson and some of his key allies in Parliament had announced that they were going to be leaving. And so Keir Starmer sought to touch upon the Conservative Party's internal difficulties. He wanted to talk about the resignation honours as well. But there'd been other news in the week as well, not least the fact that many banks and building societies were withdrawing mortgage offers, putting more pressure on people who want to buy their own home and people who are thinking about having to renew their mortgage deals. And then, of course, come Wednesday, the proceedings really were taking place beneath the shadow of the attacks that had taken place in Nottingham.
I know the whole House will want to thank the emergency services for their ongoing response to the shocking incident in Nottingham yesterday. Our thoughts are with those injured and with the families of those who lost their lives.
I join with the Prime Minister in his comments about the terrible attack in Nottingham yesterday and in tribute to the work of our emergency services. The thoughts of the whole House are with the victims and the people of that great city. All across the country, people are worried about their bills, the price of the weekly shop and the spiralling mortgage rates. So why has the Tory party spent this last week arguing over which of them gets a peerage?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my points on this are very clear. In line with a long-established convention of previous Prime Ministers having the ability to submit honours, I followed the process to the letter in convention with long-standing process. It is, by the way, Mr. Speaker, a long-standing convention that Prime Ministers on both sides of this House have followed in the same way that I did.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the truth is, for all his tough talk after the event, the Prime Minister did sign off the honours list. Yeah. And that means, Mr. Speaker, that those who threw a Downing Street party the night before the late Queen sat alone at her husband's funeral will now receive awards from the King. If he's so tough, why didn't he block it?
Mr. Speaker, as I said, I and the government follow due process and convention. Prime Ministers of both parties have always upheld the convention of non-interference on political honours. My predecessors may not have agreed with Labour's choices of Tom Watson or Shami Chakrabarti, but the same precedent, Mr. Speaker, the same precedent stood then as it does now, and I'd expect a knight like him to understand that.
During his ill-fated leadership bid late last summer, the Prime Minister warned of the perils of mortgage rate rises. Indeed, he stated, and I quote, "It's going to tip millions of people into misery, and it's going to mean we have absolutely no chance of winning the next election." Given that mortgage rates continue to rise, does he still agree with his own electoral analysis?
Mr. Speaker, which is which is absolutely why our economic policy sets as our #1 priority to reduce inflation and thereby bring interest rates, which, by the way, Mr. Speaker, have also risen in pretty much every developed economy around the world, more so in places like America and New Zealand, similar in other countries as well, like Australia. But it is important, in order to reduce inflation, that you do need to have control over borrowing, Mr. Speaker, which is why we, unlike the party opposite, are disciplined with regard to the public finances. But these are the issues that we should be focused on. I saw that the SNP yesterday, Mr. Speaker, had a meeting to discuss their future, but the only thing they managed to decide was that they should send Nicola Sturgeon some flowers. So can he tell us, did he sign the card?
Prime Minister's questions there, but elsewhere in Parliament, the ITV boss, Carolyn McCall, faced some tough questioning from MPs around the departure of Philip Schofield, the presenter from this morning. What happened there?
Yes, well, this is something that, of course, has dominated the newspaper headlines for some time now, ever since Philip Schofield left this morning, and indeed was dropped by his talent agency when he admitted that he hadn't told the truth about what he called an unwise but legal affair he had had with a younger colleague. And MPs on the Culture Committee have been wanting to get answers about this for some time, not least because they wanted to know what senior executives at ITV had known before Philip Schofield departed, but also because since his departure there's been allegations that there was a toxic culture on the programme, and this week they got the chance to cross-examine the head of ITV.
Can I just ask you, from your vantage point as the chief executive at ITV, do you class yourself in the category of the vast majority of people who seem to know what was going on, or are you telling us that everyone else knew what was going on, but somehow you and perhaps Holly Willoughby were the only ones who did not know?
The people that have said they knew would only have heard rumours about it. If any one of the individuals you have named or referenced had come to us and said there is evidence that there is a relationship between Philip Schofield and person X, we would have, with evidence, we would have been able to launch a formal investigation.
As far as you're concerned, there's no circumstances under which you could possibly have inadvertently or purposefully turned a blind eye to some serious shortcomings at this morning because it was an incredibly commercially successful programme.
It's nothing to do with it being commercially successful. It really, really isn't. Nobody would be turning a blind eye to something. It's not a blind eye. I mean, nobody here or on the management board would ever turn a blind eye to something as serious as this.
For instance, Eamon Holmes said in the tweet that Schofield has finally been caught out, but he's not the only guilty party. 4 high members of IT management knew the sort of man he was and never once took action to prevent him controlling or taking advantage of young people.
It's not surprising, is it, that when they go, they're suddenly like, oh, I hate ITV, oh, it's awful. When for a decade or more they were there, reaping the rewards and enjoying the job, and everybody seemed to get on.
I've had so many messages from folk at ITV who talk about the bullying culture of ITV. Now, it seems to me this morning you've talked about loads of investigations and they all seem to end up with ITV coming out smelling of roses. So I want to give a voice to a couple of people. If someone complains about bullying or sexual impropriety, ITV pretends to investigate. They'll do a bit of a cursory glance at the complaint. Then they will answer, and they will decide that there was no bullying. The person who complains is then ultimately forced to leave.
So they're very disappointing to hear, deeply distressing, in my view, to hear.
Dozens of them.
It is not something I recognise that characterises the whole culture at all. We've told you that we have had 5 complaints in 5 years on daytime, and we've taken all of them seriously, and only 2 of them were about bullying and any kind of question around discrimination of role.
That's the ITV boss, Carolyn McCall, taking questions from MPs there. Thanks very much for that, Sean. We'll come back to you a little later in the programme. Let's go to Edinburgh now, though, and our Scotland political correspondent, Jamie McIver, who's at the Scottish Parliament in Holyrood. Jamie, Holyrood's carrying on with its usual business, despite the headlines which followed Nicola Sturgeon's arrest and questioning. And yet again, transport has been a key issue.
It has indeed, but yes, the arrest and questioning of Nicola Sturgeon by police investigating SNP finances has very much been, to use a Scottish expression, the talk of the steamy here at Holyrood this week. The Sturgeon was released without charge, but the police investigations into SNP finances continue. But yes, the day-to-day business of Holyrood continues. At First Minister's questions, the Scottish Conservative leader, Douglas Ross, raised an ongoing issue of concern, a commitment made back in the days when Alex Salmond was the SNP leader. It concerns the A9, which is one of the key roads in Scotland, linking the Highland capital of Inverness with Perth, and through that linking the Highlands with the Central Belt. Now, much of the A9, despite its importance, is a single carriageway, and there's a lot of concern, still a lot of concern, about the number of serious accidents on the road. Well, the SNP promised to make it all a dual carriageway before they came to power back in 2007. Recently, they confirmed that a commitment to do this by 2025, a commitment they'd made several years ago, wouldn't be met. Let's hear from the Scottish Conservative leader, Douglas Ross.
The fact is, the SNP have broken their promises to dual the A9 for 16 years, and there is still no end in sight, with devastating consequences for so many families. People from Perthshire to the Highlands are scathing about this government's record. They feel they're being forgotten by SNP politicians at Holyrood. They say failing to get this fixed is a dereliction of duty. Campaigners say they fear that dualling the A9 will now take to 2050. Is it really going to take another 30 years to fulfil a promise made by the SNP more than a decade and a half ago?
It is not going to take to 2050 to dual the A9. And of course, as I said, we will give an update to Parliament as previous Transport Secretaries have said, once that work is done over the course of the summer. This is desperate stuff from Douglas Ross, who is trying to dodge, no doubt deflect, of course, from the serious scandal that his party is engulfed with Boris Johnson. Not just lying to the House of Commons, but of course betraying the people of this country and of the UK when they, of course, couldn't visit a loved one, when they couldn't attend funerals of a loved one, and they shouldn't be shouting this down, when they couldn't attend the funeral of a loved one. Boris Johnson was breaking the rules and having parties in number 10. So Douglas Ross can try to deflect, he can try to dodge, but of course nobody in this country will forget that Douglas Ross backed Boris Johnson to the very hilt, presiding officer.
It is worth making the point that there have been some improvements to the A9 in recent years. More of it is now a dual carriageway, but campaigners say that isn't enough. They want the whole of the road made a dual carriageway just as soon as possible, both on safety grounds and simply to reduce journey times.
OK, Jamie, and the threat of a strike by junior doctors in Scotland is growing, even though there haven't actually been any strikes in the NHS in Scotland so far.
Yes, and the Scottish Government is very proud of the fact that it has managed to avoid strikes in the NHS in Scotland so far, but for how much longer? Junior doctors recently rejected a pay rise worth 14.5% over 2 years. In fact, they only got that pay offer after they threatened to go on strike. Now, the reason they want a bigger rise is that they would argue that their wages simply haven't kept up with the cost of living over many years. It's about the real terms decline and the value of their pay. Now, the BMA in Scotland says that there will be 3 days of strike action by junior doctors in Scotland next month unless there's a further improvement to their pay offer. Now, the Scottish Government describes the current pay offer as the best in the UK. Let's hear from Sandish Golhani from the Scottish Conservatives.
Scottish Conservatives' freedom of information request showed almost 75,000 NHS staff have been absent in the last 5 years due to anxiety, stress, depression and other mental health-related illnesses. Morale is at rock bottom in the Scottish Health Service. Given the precarious nature of our services, Can the Cabinet Secretary guarantee that the current offer and any further offers and future offers that he will make will not be taking funding away from crucial frontline services?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I must confess I've heard of leading with your chin in a debate, but this is some brass neck that the Conservative Party have got. On the very day when in England junior doctors are on the third round of industrial action because of failure of the Conservative government in England to even engage with them meaningfully, is quite stark. It is quite stark, Presiding Officer. I'm sure Mr Gohani recognises how important we recognise this issue as, which is why we have been in detailed negotiations with junior doctors over a considerable period of time, and why the BMA viewed the offer that was made to them as being credible enough to put to their members. What I can assure the member that I will not do, I will not disrespect junior doctors in the way in which his colleagues in England have.
Now, Scotland's been affected by other major public sector strikes over the past year, including strikes by teachers and council workers. The Scottish Government, as I was saying, is always keen to make the point that strikes in the NHS in Scotland have been avoided so far. The question, I suppose, is whether a bigger pay rise for junior doctors is affordable and whether one can be negotiated in time to avoid strikes next month.
OK, Jamie. And then on another topic, there's been much discussion about whether protests and vigils should be allowed outside abortion clinics, the prospect of the law being changed, perhaps.
Indeed, and as you can imagine, it's a very sensitive and emotive topic for some. A bill designed to end vigils and protests outside abortion clinics has been lodged. And to explain a little bit about the proposed law, it aims to create a 150-metre safe access zone around the facilities which carry out abortions. Now, the MSP behind the proposal is Gillian Mackay from the Scottish Greens, and she raised it with the First Minister, Hamza Yousaf.
I lodged the final proposal for my Safe Access Zones bill, and I want to thank campaigners, those who contributed to the consultation, and MSPs across the chamber for their support. Could I invite the First Minister to take this opportunity to reaffirm his support for the bill and encourage others to sign the final proposal this afternoon to show that this Parliament will not just stand up for reproductive rights, but will advance them and strengthen them?
First Minister.
I agree with every single word of Gillian Mackay's question, and I am very happy to reaffirm my support. Women should be able to access abortions without judgment. It is simply not acceptable for anyone to experience harassment, intimidation or unwanted influence as they access what is essential healthcare. I would not have been the only one that was moved from it was a video made by one of the doctors, Dr Greg Irwin, at the Glasgow facility when he was talking about our own mothers, our own sisters, our own nieces accessing healthcare, trying to access healthcare in the face of that intimidation. So I'm delighted to see that Gillian Mackay has published the consultation analysis and the final bill proposal on safe access zones. This represents the next stage in bringing forward this essential legislation. I congratulate her for the amount of work that she has put in to get to this point, and she can be absolutely assured of the Scottish Government's commitment to giving her our full support, and I urge members across the chamber to back her proposals.
The proposed bill has cross-party support, and the first vote is due to take place in October. Now, given it has cross-party support, it would seem highly likely indeed that the bill will pass, though some groups are concerned it could represent an attack on freedom of speech. And an American lobby group is looking at the possibility of challenging the law if and when it passes.
All right, Jamie McIver, thank you very much. Jamie there in Holyrood. Let's go to Cardiff now. As the COVID inquiry opened this week, Conservatives at the Senate pressed the First Minister to say whether he stood by his policy of releasing people from hospital into care homes without testing them for COVID first. Rodri Lewis is in Cardiff Bay for us. And Rodri, it's a controversial policy.
Yes, indeed. There were endless reports about the obvious consequences of releasing patients into social care homes without checking whether or not they had COVID. And the Conservative leader, Andrew Davies, used his 3 questions to the First Minister this week to ask him whether he stood by his decision to do this. And the First Minister, Labour's Mark Drakeford, answered twice by saying this was now a matter for the COVID inquiry and it shouldn't now be discussed here at the Senate. But Mr Davies came back for a 3rd time.
So, I'll ask you again for the 3rd time, and you can turn me down again, but 3 times it reminds me of many interviews that are done on the TV where people try and stonewall. Are you hiding from something, First Minister? Because you deserve the respect to put the answer on the record to make sure that people hear what their First Minister says. So, was it the right decision to discharge patients from hospital to social care homes without testing that you took and your Health Minister took at that time?
Llywydd, I think the Leader of the Opposition lets himself down. And more importantly, he lets down the families who look to the inquiry to give them answers to those questions. And when ministers are asked that question in Holyrood and in Westminster, they will have the same answer. That the establishment of independent public inquiries to investigate into these matters means that that is where these questions must now be answered. They are not to be answered in a piecemeal fashion by shadowboxing on the floor of the Senedd.
Mark Drakeford adamant there that he wouldn't discuss the matter, but a very deliberate strategy from the Leader of the Opposition to press him 3 times on the same issue.
OK, and Plaid Cymru had a question about health too.
Yes, Plaid Cymru's interim leader, Llyr Griffith, in his last outing before the new party boss, the only candidate for the post, Trin ap Iorwerth, takes over, asked about staffing levels in the Welsh NHS. And he said his party had contacted all the Welsh health boards about how many staff they'd had over recent years, and he'd drawn this conclusion from the figures they'd received.
A noticeable trend in the responses has been the extent to which levels of administrative and clerical staff have increased, whilst the levels of medical and dental staff has gone down. For example, in the Cardiff and Vale University Health Board area, while full-time equivalent levels of administrative and clerical staff rose by 37%, there has been an almost 20% decrease in medical and dental staff over the same period, and that's a picture that's replicated in Velindre and other places as well. So does that not show, First Minister, that your government needs a more targeted and strategic approach to solving this crisis in our NHS workforce?
In the 20 years of devolution, the first 20 years of devolution, we saw a 31% increase in the number of GPs working in Wales, a 44% increase in the number of nurses working in the NHS in Wales, a 92% increase in the number of medical and dental staff, a 98% increase in scientific, therapeutic and technical staff, and a 152% increase in the number of people working in the Welsh Ambulance Service.
Now, the First Minister went on to say that Llyr Griffith was being unfair to bureaucrats as they played an important role in the NHS.
And finally, criticism of a councillor, Rodri, who said all Tories should be shot.
Yes, the Deputy Leader of Anglesey Council, Ieuan Williams, reportedly said all Tories should be shot during a meeting at the council this week. Now, that's obviously drawn a lot of criticism, especially following the killings of Joe Cox and Sir David Amess. And the councillor has since apologised, but it led to these exchanges in the Senedd.
You'll be aware that yesterday it was reported that the Deputy Leader of Anglesey Council had said that, and I quote, all Tories should be shot. We'll all be aware, of course, in the UK over the last 7 years, 2 MPs have been murdered in their role as parliamentarians, one Labour and one Conservative. This is real, literal violence, and any attempt to incite violence like that, in my view, should be met with the strongest condemnation. The language that Ieuan Williams used, I would say, is obscene and creates a foul atmosphere around our politics.
I'm very grateful to Sam Rowlands for raising this, and actually it's a topic which he returns to frequently in spokesperson's questions, which I think is really, really important, because it is one which I think transcends those party political lines, and one which we have to all stand shoulder to shoulder against any form of abuse. And healthy debate is wonderful. It's really important to be able to challenge each other, but also to do so in a way which is respectful.
Now, as I said, Councillor Williams has already apologised and says he was feeling angry and emotional about a presentation on poverty on Anglesey when he's made what he says was a crass remark. He's now stepped down as Deputy Leader pending an investigation.
All right, Rhodri, thank you very much for the update. That's Rhodri Lewis at Cardiff Bay. Let's go back to Westminster now. And Sean, you're still with me. There's been lots of discussion recently, hasn't there, about policing public protests. And on Monday, there were some changes to the Public Order Act that give a clearer definition of serious disruption. Can you explain why it's so controversial?
Yes. So the government said it wanted to make it easier for the police to understand their powers, and they were going to clarify the law. So they were doing this through regulations. It's still the law, but it's different from an Act of Parliament, which has to go through lots of stages in the Commons and the Lords. Now, this is controversial for lots of reasons, because some people in the Commons and the Lords have argued that the government is overreaching itself and is clamping down on protests. But the other reason was a very parliamentary one, and that's because these measures had been part of a debate when the Lords were discussing what is now the Public Order Act. And the government had tried to introduce the changes then, and they had lost the vote. So these measures had already been rejected once by Parliament, and it was felt that the government should not, this is by the government's opponents, of course, that the government should not be trying to introduce them, reintroduce them through this method where there's not as much scrutiny and there's not as much time for debate. So what we had this week was a debate in the House of Commons, followed then by a debate in the House of Lords, when we saw an attempt to try to block the changes. But the week began with the Home Secretary setting out the case in the House of Commons for this change.
People have a right to get to work on time, free from obstruction. Yep. A right to enjoy sporting events without interruption, and a right to get to hospital. The roads belong to the British people, not a selfish minority who treat them like their personal property. I find it surprising and disappointing to see that Labour MPs are not supporting the measures put forward today, given how important they are to the public and how damaging serious disruption can be to everyday life. And I've been trying to think about why that would be. I wonder if it's got anything to do with the fact that the Labour Party, the Leader of the Opposition and his deputy have taken £1.5 million in donations from a businessman who bankrolls Just Stop Oil. Or I wonder whether it's because it appears that their botched environmental policies seem to be directed now by the eco-zealots. The Right Honourable Lady should be embarrassed that Labour is more interested in supporting Just Stop Oil than standing up for the law-abiding majority.
You can see why Conservative ministers might be worried about an organised minority of people causing disruption. People who want to protest against decisions made by the Prime Minister, who ignore all normal rules and have no respect for everyone else, causing serious disruption to the nation, to the government, lighting skip fires from Uxbridge to Selby. We have criticised groups like Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion for damaging protests that even put lives at risk. The police have a serious and important job to do in a democracy, making sure that people can go about their business and also protecting our historic freedoms. But they already have the powers to do exactly that.
The difference with these protests is that actually the disruption is the objective. The message is not the objective. We understand here in Westminster more than anywhere that disruption can be a byproduct of protest, but a byproduct, not the primary objective, and it's that to which the British people feel so aggrieved.
Go on a hunger protest. Disrupt your own life. Don't eat. That'll get in the news. Why do you think you can go around disrupting everybody else's lives just to make your point? And of course, importantly, you can still protest. I was flabbergasted by the reporting of the apparent crackdown on protests at the coronation. I was on the estate. I saw loads of people holding up signs saying "Not my king." It was all over the news. I saw lots of people who weren't arrested, who weren't moved on, who were within feet of the procession, who were perfectly able to go about protesting.
I think this statutory instrument is oppressive, it is anti-democratic and it is downright wrong. It's anti-rights legislation by executive diktat.
It's a profound insult to people and Parliament, of which I think this government should be ashamed. In short, it is authoritarian in both style and substance.
So that was the Commons on Monday, but the debate didn't end there, did it? Tell us about what happened on Tuesday.
Yes, so the Commons voted and Labour voted against the regulations, but the government won with a majority of 60. In order for these changes to take place, both houses have to approve them. So the next day, the order goes to the House of Lords. Now, there, the situation was a bit different. First of all, Labour said they would not actually vote to block the regulations because they argued that it isn't the House of Lords' job to stop the elected House getting its way. So there was a tension there immediately on the opposition benches. But also, very unusually, a Green Party peer, Lady Jones, brought forward what is called a fatal motion with the idea of killing off this change straight away. So she wanted to block the change to the law. So the Lords had what was a pretty lively debate when they considered the regulations.
Without these changes, there is potential for confusion over what is the lawful extent of protest activity. The police and public will have to grapple with one threshold for criminal offences in the new Public Order Act and another for the use of discretionary police powers in the 1986 Act. With these changes, it will be easier for all to understand when disruption from a protest is no longer legitimate. The current Just Stop Oil Slow Walk campaign has resulted in the use of over 13,770 police officer shifts, diverting police attention away from local communities. Financially, this has cost the taxpayer £4.5 million in just 6 weeks, and this is in addition to the £14.5 million it cost last year.
It is an absolute fundamental constitutional outrage, what is actually taken place. My Lords, this House defeated these or similar proposals brought forward in a panic, as I said, by Lord Sharp, without knowing really that he was have to do it early this year. Primary legislation was defeated. So what does the government do? It doesn't bring forward new primary legislation. It tries to sneak through in an underhand way secondary legislation without proper public consultation. We will respect convention. We will respect tradition. We will respect the right way of doing politics in our country. And I don't believe that it necessarily shows any respect for the way that democracy votes by voting down the opinion of the elected government of the day.
The government has not respected our conventions. So there are two issues at stake here. First, the suppression of freedom with a measure that your Lordship's House rejected as unreasonable only very recently. And in some ways more seriously, secondly, a government move that sets a precedent that the government can use secondary legislation to overrule Parliament's will, as expressed in votes in primary legislation. Now, this means that any future minister, at any time, could decide to change any law in any way. Now, this to me is deeply, deeply disturbing.
It's all very well for Lord Rooker to talk about the other place being the dominant house, which they are, and that we must give way to them, but not when there is a constitutional outrage, not when, as we all know, scrutiny of regulations is cursory at best.
I say to the noble lords on the Conservative benches, is, as appears ever more likely with each passing day, there will be a change of government at the next general election. You will be creating a precedent that you are likely to regret for many years to come, when the incoming government uses this precedent to undermine the will of this House in the future. We will vote for the fatal motion.
Well, that was the Lords talking about the Public Order Act. Now, finally, we began today's programme by talking about the ITV boss being questioned by MPs. But the BBC's Director General, Tim Davie, was called up to be questioned by MPs as well. Can you tell us about what that involved?
Yes. So the Culture Committee, who we heard a little bit earlier on, talking to those ITV executives, they hold regular evidence sessions with Tim Davie, the Director General of the BBC, so they can cross-examine him about, well, anything really affecting the BBC. But in recent weeks and months, there's been a lot of concern from MPs, there's been a lot of anger about changes to local radio. And in fact, BBC journalists in England and in the Channel Islands have been on strike over the changes. And because MPs have talked about this a lot in the Commons, it was kind of inevitable, I think, that when they got the Director General in front of them, they would press him about the changes and push him to defend what he's doing.
You continue to face questions from staff, unions, parliamentarians and even Ofcom about the changes, the cuts you're making to BBC local radio. Given these seem to have very little support, how can you continue with these changes?
Local radio is precious. The connection with people who, often aren't digitally connected, all of that is absolutely critical to the BBC. There is a but, which is it does have a big audience, but it is 13% of the population. So an incredibly precious 5 million people, but it's 13% of the population. And the linear local radio market has been declining about 20% over the last few years. Yes, there is a painful choice, which is the sharing of programmes in the afternoon going to 20 rather than 39. You can't avoid that. That is where you cut, and then you are able to then invest in digital, where we are increasing the headcount by 130 in terms of other areas, putting 71 investigative journalists in, building 11 journalism hubs. I think that's the right decision. I really do.
I'm thinking about my constituents who are slightly older than the average in East Devon. And the radio is their friend. Social isolation is a real problem in the UK. BBC local radio is that friend. Yeah. It's not going to be as relevant to them.
Remember, we're not changing the breakfast programming. We've got 39 breakfast programmes mid-morning. That's where most of the listening is. There is a compromise here. There inevitably is. With this financial framework, there is a compromise.
Are you concerned that your cuts to BBC local radio make you the Mr. Beeching of local broadcasting?
No, because I can understand why, and I think some of the communication I get, it gets into that area, which is, are we managing the decline of local radio? Have we made some kind of strategic choice to get out of local radio and local? I hope, I won't go through the whole argument again, I'll save the committee that, but it's quite the reverse actually. We actually care deeply about local, we want local to grow, and we want to keep local radio stations. We're just making some adjustments to free up some money.
Is it toxic to tell long-serving reporters in BBC local radio they can only stay on if they take a substantial pay cut and demotion? Surely that's fire and hire, isn't it? You'd expect that at P&O Ferries, not on our national broadcaster, paid for by a licence fee imposed by statute with the threat of imprisonment if they don't pay it.
I'd be very...
Has that happened? Does that not happen?
I'm not aware of that situation.
At Radio Solent, which serves my constituents, well-known presenters with years of local knowledge were asked in interviews to sell themselves in 60 seconds and told to produce demo tapes, which Dropbox receipts, I'm told, show that they're never even viewed by the managers who asked for them. Now, a presenter can turn around and do a 60-second clip about a news story.
Of course.
But doing it about yourself, your 60 seconds to save your career, it's workplace bullying, isn't it?
I think what the team have tried to do is get a process that is fair to everyone and level the playing field.
Is that fair? If I said to you, no, give me 60 seconds, Tim Davey, as to why you should stay Director General, is it fair?
Well,
bullying,
I think when I was interviewed for Director General, if I may, I mean, it's not, I was given a chance to do a pitch, I was given the presentation, and I did my work. I think everyone will have a view on the process. I think the management there are trying to be fair and trying to level the playing field. Is it pleasant to go through? No.
The Director General taking questions from MPs there. Thank you very much for talking us through all of that, Sean. Now that's all for Politics UK for this week. Joe will be back with Politics Live on Monday at 12:15 on BBC Two and iPlayer. But in the meantime, have a great weekend.